Welcome to the Exhorter podcast, where it is our aim to stir up love and good works through bite-sized biblical conversation. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we've got a great topic. We're going to talk about disagreeing with others and how to do that in a loving way. Paul, I think this is your topic. You want to explain this a little bit more in depth for us?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. I'm going to talk about this topic because of things that I think we've all seen over the years of it being done right and it being done wrong. There's so many things where we may not agree with a brother or sister in Christ on a topic. And I'll give you an example of ways that we've seen this take place. When I was a kid, they still had a lot of these church periodicals that were published throughout churches, and they would talk about a particular topic. But if you go back even further, I remember opening up these articles, and often it was an attack on another preacher or brother in Christ over a topic that was clearly they were not talking to each other. They were writing dueling articles, and it sounded like they hadn't really talked to each other. And frankly, it was pretty negative and maybe bordering defamatory sometimes in some of those. And as a young Christian, I remember reading this thinking, this is kind of discouraging. Reading some of that, even if what they were saying may have been in good intentions, but it sure didn't come across. And then we see that in social media. We don't agree, and somebody posts something and we see comments back and forth that may not be encouraging anyone to really change their mind. And then finally, I disagree with someone on a topic and I'm really not sure, how do I approach them in love? And so what I want to talk about today is we do have biblical examples of people who did that. And what are some tips of things that we can do to disagree in love? But to you guys, have you seen that? Have you seen disagreement in a way that didn't represent Christ as it should have?
I think on social media a lot, it seems like more statements to get things off your chest or to make your point be made. But it's really hard to see what the end result or the goal of said comments are. Is the goal really to convince someone of your perspective, or is it in a loving way to rebuke or exhort? You never see that kind of understanding through online comments, which is probably just to say, stay off online, keep those comments in person.
And it's pretty one-sided. There's not much listening that goes on in those formats. I know exactly what you're talking about. As a young preacher, really before social media was the thing that it is, the monster that it is today, I would pore over some of these old, brotherhood periodicals, and I would see the very same letters, if you will, written about people, not conversations with people. And it always struck me as they're acting like they're apostles or something, and it's their job to go around the church bigger than just a congregational level. And well, Paul called out Peter, and well, they were apostles. We're not apostles today.
Yeah, and sometimes it was they may have been set up as kind of the self-described expert. I'm the one who knows this, you don't. I could agree with you, but then we both be wrong, kind of a thing, instead of approaching it with humility. So we're going to talk about that. And maybe you've been approached and seen it done wrong. Another example that I saw, Kyle, that I remember was, this goes back a ways in technology, but do you remember listservs? It was email groups, and there was a couple of these email groups that would have preachers from across the country sharing topics. And as a young Christian, like college age, I loved it because I may have had a question. So I would just send an email to this group. Hey, I got a question on this topic. I'm trying to talk to somebody. And I would get 50 responses from preachers that was really helpful to me. But some of the conversation threads were on topics for which they disagreed. Parts of the group were almost going to separate or excommunicate other members of the group. It somehow devolved, and it became less doing it in love and more another way that wasn't working. Clearly, nothing good was coming from it.
Politics has become a lot more mainstream. We get into it as Americans. Also, the mentality around politics has creeped into the way we think about God's word and arguments and disagreements in God's word, because the most annoying thing about politics is there's only two ways to think about something, and you're on the right or the wrong side of that in other people's perspective. And kids see this all the time. And so I think that some of that kind of mentality has also creeped into our mentality, where we think less about how to come to an agreement with a brethren on a topic and more about stating the differences between those viewpoints, which is politics, is making sure you've drawn a really hard line between a right and a left or a right and a wrong mentality. And so in the church, shouldn't be our focus. We shouldn't be our goal to make sure and divide those two perspectives, but to align on God's perspective. It's less about us, more about him.
No, I think that nails it. So let's get into it. We're going to talk about just some simple tips of things that we can do. And we'll try to look at biblical examples to disagree in love. And so one of them is the way we talk to people when we disagree. Have you ever heard an idea or a belief that you think is just absolutely ridiculous? If you're listening, I'm sure, yep, I've heard that. When you look at that, can you think of an example in the Bible where somebody had to either talk to a church or write a letter where there was some pretty crazy beliefs or stuff going on?
1 Corinthians right there about the sin that was happening in the church at the time. That must have been pretty obvious to him.
That's exactly where we were going. So let's take the Apostle Paul. So, and I'm not going to read all this, but if you open up 1 Corinthians 1 at home and you get a chance, Paul was approaching a church in Corinth that had a ton of problems going on in their church and beliefs that were causing big issues. And what we see with Paul is a desire, rather than to embarrass or create issues, rather there's something that was dividing them, and he wanted to separate that and speak to them in love and used what I would call relational language. And because that was the goal, you'll notice in the introduction, he called them by name, but he also talked about them as his brother or his sister or fellow Christians and everything, he called them my friend. The desire was to maintain, to strengthen, or restore that relationship. And so I'm not going to read it right now, but when you get a chance, look up 1 Corinthians 1. But to put it in terms in our time today, brother, I'm so thankful for a friendship. I want this conversation to draw us closer together. That's our goal. Approach it using language like that is one way to begin the conversation. So Paul's an example of not just that, but when he approaches other Christians or churches or unbelievers, he had another approach, Kyle, that we were talking about earlier. Do you want to lead that one off?
Well, another way that I often find it can be productive in these situations is to try and find some common ground where you maybe express, you might have a divide between you and the other person, but you can always find some sort of common ground and you express that agreement. You say, well, let's highlight some of the ways. It might be a debate, and you could acknowledge that both of you have strong feelings about it. That's the common ground, that this is very important to me, and it's very important to you as well. That's just one example of this, where you're finding this common ground. Kind of like in Acts chapter 17, as Paul is going around Athens, and he's noticing all these different idols, all these different tributes to other gods. And he tells them as he stands in the midst of the Areopagus, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through, I noticed and was considering the objects of your worship. I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.'" So he starts with this idea that you're very religious. You have a devotion to the divine. However, what you're worshiping is done in ignorance. There is a name. You have this unknown, unnamed God, just in case you missed one, acknowledging that the possibility that you might not have acknowledged the right or correct God. And he says, I appreciate that you're very religious. You're very devoted to the divine. However, let's put a name and face to the divine. Let me explain some things to you. Let me fill in some of the blanks you have. But he started with that common ground.
It's a great way to begin, Kyle, that he starts with really what do we have in common instead of they seem very far apart. They're worshiping idols, but he starts with the positive. John, if we talk about other ways that we can do this when we're talking to others, what would you say? Well,
obviously, you're leading with a lot of positivity here. You're wanting to set a common ground in a positive way. One of the ways that, Romans 15:2 says, let each of us please his neighbor for his good to build him up. And one of the great ways to build people up is give them a compliment. If, for example, they are bringing a very thoughtful argument and approach to it, maybe they've studied this, maybe they have some insight, don't just discount that they're bringing an idea out of nowhere, right? And that they haven't done any due diligence. But, you can say, you seem like an incredibly thoughtful person, or that you've thought through this very well.
I might not agree with you that the world is going to end because of irreversible climate change in 10 years. but I can tell you've done your homework and you've really spent a lot of time researching.
Yeah. And maybe I really admire your passion for the subject, or that you've thought this well. It just you're verbalizing respect, you're verbalizing compassion and understanding. You're not discounting. And most of the time that's the problem is we rush to discount someone's thought before we've really respected them as a person, as a living being, as someone who's,
That's why this happens so much and to such an extreme degree on social media, because you're removing that personal connection. You're responding to a comment, not even in your mind, you're not even responding to another human being. So you add that degree of anonymity, and that makes it even worse. Not only do you not see them as a person, but they're not even a person that you know in real life. So no consequence. Say whatever foul thing comes to your mind. Say whatever hurtful thing. That's why comment sections are often entertaining, but also really sad depictions of the worst of human behavior.
That's the worst. Here's an important part about a compliment, though. Seek its genuineness. Do not flatter. We have in Proverbs, we were talked about, those who try to find favor and flatter. People can see through some of that stuff a lot of times. And so for it to be effective, it's important that it comes from a genuine place. And it's also how you grow as a person. Empathizing with people is when it comes from a genuine place. So actually think it through, make a compliment, but make a compliment that's an actual compliment, something you actually do admire or you see as a good thing from that person, not something that will just flatter them to make them feel good.
Paul, the salt and pepper look in your beard is very appealing for a man of your age and stature.
That's a backhanded compliment.
Well, you wanted a compliment.
Yeah.
There we go. It's also disarming. And somebody gave me this example once, and it sticks with me. If you lead with the negative, have you ever seen conversations, and I know especially again on social media, where you could tell no one's really listening to each other? Is as soon as that comment comes, they're already preparing for their response. It's all about a point counterpoint rather than listening. Somebody gave me the example one time about offering a compliment. If someone comes up to you on Sunday and, if I see John and say, man, John, that is a really nice shirt and tie. I mean, it looks really good on you. Your pants don't match at all, but nice shirt and tie.
Well, now you're picking on someone because he's colorblind.
You're talking about the backhanded compliment. You're talking about the
what did you hear?
Yeah.
Or if you talk to your wife, you look beautiful tonight.
It really takes away from that mole on your face, right?
What did they hear? Well, all they heard was, what? My pants don't match. Or what? You're looking at this. It's no different when we talk to people if they start with the negative, but you start with the positive. Now it's kind of disarming, and now they're listening. And so this is a tactic. It's a tip. But I like what you said, John. It really needs to be authentic. And if you can't find a compliment like that to say, maybe you shouldn't comment.
And if it doesn't come, they're going to be listening for a but. It will catch them off guard. They will naturally be listening for that but or however or something, that you're going to actually lead into. Because I don't think people are used to being complimented. They're not used to this. They get right into the argument and speak their mind. And so it's that much more important to be genuine.
Might I recommend also finishing with a compliment and completing the poop sandwich? I wish I had a better way to describe this, but this is even a sanitized version of what to call it. I can't think of a better way to describe it. You start with a compliment, then you get into the more distasteful part of the conversation, but you finish with a compliment. So leave all the distasteful, difficult, quarrelsome stuff in the middle, but begin and end with a compliment as well.
Yeah, that's management 101, right?
If you don't remember anything else about this podcast, remember poop sandwich.
Poop sandwich, yes.
I heard a sermon about that one, so I figured
It's a very common management style.
So another tip that we need to think of, have you ever been in a situation where you've heard someone talking about someone else with whom they disagree? And I'll just give an example. I was talking to someone years ago, and they were talking about a preacher who had a different position on a topic. And they made some assumptions. I think it was on the controversial topic of MDR. And they were talking about a preacher who they believed to change their view. And they had
people fight over this.
It occasionally comes up just every once in a while.
Okay.
I've never heard of it.
But what they said to me really got my attention. They said, well, this preacher changed their mind because they had somebody in their family that went through a divorce. And after that happened, they changed their mind. And when I heard that, it really bothered me. So I had to ask, can you tell me, how do you know that? Well, because they changed their mind and this happened, that must be the case. And so there was, at the end of the day, this person conceded, well, I'm just assuming that's the case. And there was really no confirmation or facts. It's just, I had heard it and therefore it must be true. And so when you disagree with a person, however much you may know them, or in this case, they didn't even know the person, they just heard it, give the benefit of the doubt. In the absence of information, assume the best about the person, their motives, their intentions, their attitudes. And this is something in the workplace I'd like to share with my team is I'm always going to assume the best unless I see something that proves me wrong. But we don't know their hearts. And so when you're disagreeing with someone, don't assume that you know their motives or you can read their mind. Only God can do that.
Well, and this is an immediate conversation stopper. And if that's our goal, is to try and understand the other person and have them understand our point of view and work towards a common understanding, if you make a comment or an assumption like this, it's going to screech to a halt. Because I've had people say that to me before, something to the effect of, well, you're just repeating what you've been taught in the Church of Christ. Okay, so right then and there, they're telling me you don't have a brain between your ears. You can't think for yourself. You're just parroting things you've heard. You're unoriginal. You don't even have a thought that's your own. How am I going to respond to that? That tells me right there they're not interested in anything I have to say. So conversation's effectively over.
Good point. It shuts it down. So we've mentioned the Apostle Paul here some, and he said in that same 1 Corinthian letter, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And so approaching it that way, it is possible they have good intentions. You disagree with them. So a way to communicate that is something like, I'm sure you and I have the same goals in this situation. We just see things a little bit differently. Let's talk about it. And so the approach of giving the benefit of the doubt, and kind of similar to that is, and this may be the most difficult one to consider, but for Christians, when you talk to someone else with whom you disagree, consider them superior. And let me explain what I mean. Philippians 2 and verse 3, Paul says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. And again, John, to what you were saying, and Kyle, what you were saying about authenticity, you got to really feel this way, is approach them in humility when you're doing this.
When I struggle in a conversation that is becoming combative and I'm getting to the point where I want to start saying harsh things or I'm losing my patience with the other person, I actually think of Philippians 2, and this is like an idiom that I repeat to myself. Kyle, they're more important than you. They're more important than you. They are more important than you. I just keep telling myself and reminding myself of that fact that I'm not the center of the universe. It's my job to serve others and think on that truth that they're more important than me.
Well, that goes contrary to everything society tells us we should say about ourselves. And kids grow up thinking they're the center of the universe. But I love that verse. I think that it would solve so many of our problems in the church and relationships and marriage and everything, especially marriage, right? Is a lot of times that pride just creeps in and elevating oneself and one's perspective over another. And so,
well, and let's be real. A lot of times we start the conversation with doing it that way, and maybe the other person starts talking to you in a way that is insulting, or Kyle, like the point that was made to you, where now they're essentially saying you don't have a brain, or what, in the way that they're talking. Well, what's our tendency? Well, now that you started down that road, I'm going to go down that road. And so if the conversation devolves to that, you don't have to reduce yourself to that. You can certainly continue to keep that same attitude, but don't lower yourself and lose the intent of that, still approaching them with humility. And then from the beginning of the conversation and to the end, just showing gratitude. They're not obligated to listen to you, but just being thankful that they're listening, they're talking to you. They could just ignore or dismiss you, but it could be something simple like, I really appreciate you hearing me out. It means a lot to me that you're willing to listen and we could chat with this. And so I think that's another important piece. It's all part of that same humility of being thankful that they're listening to you.
That's not the only time that's mentioned in those scriptures in Ephesians, with all humility and gentleness, patience, bearing one another in love. And I always think that when I think of long suffering.
You can't demand that someone listen to you, but you can request consideration. And so as you're talking to people about these things, we can't force them, but an example of, is it possible we could also think of this topic this way and ask it in a way that opens the door for them to listen.
We've used these tactics in sales and other things is affirming or stating, wouldn't you also agree? Or you're leaving the opportunity open for an additional perspective. And usually when you've asked permission to do that, can we also agree that there might be another idea here? Usually people are a little bit more open to hearing that versus this idea refutes your idea.
Well, I'll give you an example of when I have found it most challenging in my past to actually do this. I'm talking to someone that I really, that is telling me maybe even a very emotional story about how they were saved. And they share the whole story. And then when they share it, it's not what I read in the Bible. And so there's two ways to, respond to that. And I think the best way, instead of, you're wrong. That's not how to do it, is simply to say, that's amazing, an amazing story that you just shared, but, I was saved differently. Can we talk about that? Let's open the Bible, because the way you're describing is different than how I was saved. Would you be willing to open the Bible to consider this?
And that happens a lot when you hear a lot of people being called, or there's a different way, or I heard the voice of Jesus, and you're like, are you literally hear the voice of Jesus? And that's a really great way to introduce this idea without just thinking, okay, you're crazy.
Probably a better approach too than pulling the pin and tossing the grenade. 1 Peter 3:21, baptism now saves.
And that's how we sometimes do it as well. What about this? What about that? And
I'm just saying the truth.
Yeah. And guess what? Now the defenses are up. Instead of, hey, again, keep that humility. Would you be willing to talk about this? And now you're making it personal for you too. Hey, I was saved differently. Would you be willing to talk about that?
I wonder if that's sometimes we think about the analogy of the Bible being a sword in the wrong way, because the sword is also to defend. It's also to parry. It's also to defend an attack, but we use it as a legitimate offensive weapon to smash someone down.
So when you get towards the end of the conversation, just something to remember, whether you're talking to them, but especially when it's online or it's a message, is wishing them well. Would you ever walk away from a conversation without at least saying goodbye or something positive? But even in maybe you don't resolve the issue. Maybe you're still in disagreement at the end.
You can always curse them under your breath, but at least
No, we just talked about that one. We can't do that.
That's a different, euphemisms are fine.
Yes, we can't do that anymore, Kyle.
And hopeful. I can't wait to see again. Maybe we can catch up and talk about this further. You don't have to reach a conclusion of agreement each time, but leave it positive, wish them well.
Right. You don't have to view them. You might be in disagreement over something, but that doesn't mean you have to view them as the enemy.
Even before you're done with a conversation, sometimes you don't have enough time to have the full conversation you really need to have, or to do it justice to a respectful conversation. And so maybe even when you're leaving there, you can ask, could we continue this conversation another time? And that gives you some opportunity to think through your thoughts and kind of, now I know where this person is coming from, but even say, I feel like this conversation might need a little bit more time and respect, and I really value what we're talking about here. Would it be agreeable? Could we actually table this for a moment, come back to it, and talk about this another time? Because I don't think we need to necessarily agree to put a period on this conversation, but I really want to give it its due time.
It's all how we end it, and keeping that optimism and hope for the next conversation, I think is really, really important.
Rather than, I'm great, I have an exit, I just found that exit, and I'm out of here, and I think people can see when you're trying to pull away from a conversation. Take your time, find these opportunities, treat them with the respect needed, and the person with the respect they're due.
So another one that relates especially to the social media, you see a post for which you completely disagree, or a comment for which you completely disagree. Remove the sarcasm when you comment and respond. You see something disagreeable, you're like, all right, I'm going to get on there. I'm going to make a rude or snarky or sarcastic comment, and I'm going to put it out there. Before you do that, pause and try to consider the other person's perspective and why they may have posted that. Even if you disagree. And I'm going to go back to Paul, 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient and kind. It also says it is not arrogant or rude. It is not irritable or resentful. And so anything that's taken that way, you need to make it abundantly clear that even though you disagree, you have every intention of being patient and kind as you talk to them about that issue.
And coming back to the idea of they are more important than me, I think what you're suggesting is think before you speak, think before you type. And one question to ask, they're more important than me. Is this comment helpful for them, or is it more about saying this will make me feel good?
Sarcasm has a unique place in our lives because we also see it as like a part of our personality that we enjoy or we like. And when we find it in other people, we find a common, oh, they're sarcastic like me. We're so alike. And I've also heard of sarcasm being anger's ugly cousin, right? Funnier, but which makes us think of it as less ugly. But at the end of the day, it's just veiled anger or frustration. It doesn't make it any better.
Paul used sarcasm on occasion, but again, it was not something he said, I don't think, just to make him kind of chuckle and say, I'm going to let him have it. It was to a purpose, and it can highlight some inconsistencies in someone's life. Sarcasm can be a good way to draw attention to it, but I think sarcasm is something that should be used very sparingly, at least in confrontational situations.
Well, it's my favorite type of humor. And I think whatever. But I don't think I think there's a difference between seeing and hearing it and maybe using it with people in the context of them understanding and knowing, but using it as a veiled way to approach a topic that is important, like we're talking about. We're talking about using sarcasm in lieu of the right words to the right end goal, which is love, which is consideration, which is resolution to a problem. You can't get resolution with sarcasm.
The challenge I find with sarcasm, too, is that sometimes people don't get when I'm being sarcastic.
You'll never get when I'm being sarcastic.
And it's even harder to convey that correctly through written words.
That's why we use emojis.
Yeah.
Like the eye roll or the halfway slant or the
smiley face where he's sticking his tongue out.
The meh, those ones.
So I think with Paul, we need to be clear that if he ever did something like that, it was in a positive light or to make a point, but not snarky or rude or dismissive. It was he could be firm as an apostle.
He was trying to call attention.
Yes.
Trying to call attention to some of their inconsistencies, and sarcasm was his way of doing that at times.
But this was also an inspired apostle who had the Holy Spirit working through him as he wrote a letter, correcting them on something that they were doing that was wrong. We are not that. Sometimes there's people online that may sound like that as if they are the expert.
Some of those comments really feel like people think that they're channeling the Holy Spirit. But one of the things I think we see this in politics, and we tend to idolize a lot of people, maybe in conservative media and things like this, that use sarcasm to make points. And we idolize that. We think that's like a really good way of comeback and putting people in their place and making a point. But in politics, as we said, the purpose isn't resolution. The purpose is division, is making sure people understand the difference between two perspectives. I think, although I find that process humorous, I don't think we should idolize that as the way we communicate with other people.
You make a good point. It's interesting. I don't know. It's human nature, but we're drawn to that. This is my position. And I even find myself, I'm looking up a video and the title of the video is, so-and-so roasts the other person, click here to watch. And you see a forum in which the guy just nails them and it's like, yes. Because it's the point in which you agree. So there's something in our nature that's drawn to that. And when you're talking to someone, the main point of this is let's go back to the example of commenting about something for which you disagree. If you've typed something and it could be seen as sarcastic, rude, snarky, resentful, take it out. Take it out. Make it clear that even though you disagree, you've got every intention of being patient and being kind.
Yeah, consider deleting these things, because at the end of the day, you need to ask yourself, is it right for the platform? Is it right for who is it going to benefit? What are the consequences of doing this? Be very self-aware about how you are coming off. Most of the time, we're really bad at this. People are not very socially aware. People do not really understand how other people receive and see them. And I think that's a really important thing to do. Emails, posts, comments, letters, even in person. Always do that self-check with people and make sure that you are being perceived in the best way and the way you intend.
I saw a preacher recently, someone I really respect and someone I follow closely the things they write. And he made a comment, an observation about something happening in the news, but tried to make a spiritual application without really commenting on the politics of the event itself. But inevitably in the comment section, everyone kept trying to make it political. It devolved, and no matter how much he tried to clarify or add further degrees of clarity to it. Just, you're misunderstanding me, you're misinterpreting. Things got ugly, and it wasn't all directed at him, but people started fighting against each other. And I think he felt a sense of ownership. It was my comment, and it's in my comment section, and he chose to simply, people aren't getting the point, and this isn't productive. Let's just remove the whole thing altogether.
On that medium, people really aren't listening. Why? Because nothing actually is being spoken. You have to read through everything. But as soon as you get halfway down a large, huge post and you see a word or two that you think about, you already think about your response. You see a couple words that you don't hit you right, and it doesn't matter if they clarify that, 3 sentences below, you've already been triggered and you're already writing your next response. And it is absolutely not the way to have these conversations.
I still prefer face-to-face. I don't really think progress happens online. That's just what I'm convinced of. I don't get involved in these things online. If I'm going to talk to someone about a controversial subject or something that's confrontational where we have different views, I want to do it face-to-face in person or over the phone, at least where I'm talking to the person. Online, just more often than not, feels like what you described. Two sides with a wide gap between them, getting further entrenched and lobbing grenades at each other from their side of the argument.
There's something about the emotion of seeing something and just, I got to get something off now and I'll feel better. And I remember, even in history, was that President Lincoln was really upset with one of his generals, wrote this long blistering letter, which they later found in his records. And I think you can still see it today. Put it in his desk and realized, you know what? I wrote that with emotion, never sent it. So when you're writing, especially on a post and a comment, ask yourself, is this the right platform for this? Is this the right time? Am I the right person? And step back before you send it to really think, what are the benefits of me doing this?
Bring up your notes app, type in your whole thoughts and your feelings about that. It's basically like journaling, right? You're getting your emotions out there and you read it 2 or 3 times. And by the time you're done with it, you probably realize, okay, this won't come off well, or I'm not going to send this. But if you really have that itch, Paul, as you're talking about, of I feel like I have to get this off my chest or it has to be addressed, use a note app, use something in which you can actually write down those thoughts, keep it, think about it, maybe share it with a spouse, walk through this conversation and look for the point of how you're actually going to get to a resolution. Would that comment actually fit in that conversation? Would it actually get you closer to that resolution?
Or am I really trying to help them change their mind or just make my point? And I want to confess, I've done this, even on comments that came in through social media to our church website. I remember one where it was an atheist and very arrogant, in his approach, kind of like you said, Kyle, very much demeaning and insulting in his responses. And I remember one night I couldn't let his response be the last word. And so every comment, I remember being late at night and Londa's like, what are you doing? I'm like, just one more response. And I think back on it now and I need to think if, even though I wanted it to hopefully convince him, but was that my motivation or was it just I was insulted and I had to have the last word? And so keeping our emotions in check and really, okay, what's the benefit of this? And to Kyle's point, maybe the better thing would have been, I'd love to talk to you more about this in a different platform or privately rather than doing it the way we are. Let's talk further. And if it doesn't happen, then that's on them. But at least we've tried instead of, I'm going to have the last word. So,
well, if it makes you feel better, I've seen those troll comments come through in the past too, because we share the same, account there. And I've always been impressed by the way that you actually, I don't know if you went through a couple different drafts, but you do generally get to a very good statement of let's talk about that. We'd love to talk about this more. Just basically not here. Another person I think is really good at that is Doi Moyer always has a really great way of addressing these things. And he chooses to engage in that realm. And that's the thing is not many people do. And I would say that unless you are absolutely fully equipped to do so, should you? That's a skill and that's a craft that you craft over time based upon being in conversation with a lot of people. And so something you develop over time.
I wouldn't want to square off against Doi.
Even class, right? Because you took some of his classes.
Yeah, Old Testament history. And this is a good way to bring back an earlier point about wish them well, because I've seen this a couple of times and it's not necessarily on our comment section, but more like Facebook, anyone out there commenting, nothing to do with our particular congregation here in Clovis. But I'll see quote unquote Christians, they'll end an exchange with an atheist like, well, when you die and you face judgment and you're burning in hell, then you'll know that I was right. Probably not a Christ-like way. When did Jesus ever end a conversation like that? Well,
and you mentioned Doi. I noticed recently that he had a post up on something that had very positive intentions and was just his perspective on something. And it wasn't his comments, but on the post, there was a number of comments that were turning political and negative.
This is what I was referencing earlier, the nameless preacher. And that's another reason why I don't engage in these kinds of things. If Doi, who is very eloquent and very good at crafting, written thoughts, if he's misunderstood like that, what chance do I have? That's kind of the way I look at it. But,
and I say from a positive that I was impressed that when he saw that it was kind of going that direction, he removed the post, and he later just posted that for that reason, because he didn't, for the very things we're talking about, that's not what his intent was. And so he decided, let's remove the post. This is the intention. And he stopped, and he was doing what I saw was positive, but he didn't want it to go that direction in the comments on his post. And I appreciated what he did. Well, we talked about a lot of tips here, and we could keep going, but I hope and pray that these tips that we've talked about are helpful when you're engaging either on social media or in person with somebody with whom you disagree, and hope that these tips may be helpful as we look at a biblical perspective on how we can do better with the intent of coming to agreement and really coming closer together.
Well, thank you so very much, Paul. You've given us so much to think about, so much to apply as we have these interactions in person and through social media. We hope this episode has been an encouragement to you. If it's been helpful, please return the favor and like and subscribe. Or if you think it'd be helpful for someone else, please pass it along and share this episode as well. We'd also like to invite you to share your feedback, give us suggestions for topics you'd like to hear us discuss through our Facebook page, Exhorter Podcast. You can see us on our new Facebook page. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you again soon.
This is a podcast, guys. You guys remember we don't actually see people in person. Also, leave a positive comment on the Facebook page.
You know what? I thought of something a better illustration than poop sandwich. How about a cucumber and hummus sandwich? Because that's pretty gross in and of itself. And it's a little better to say that than poop sandwich.